In December 1942, somewhere above the Solomon Islands, a 19-year-old waist gunner named Eddie Kowalski stood inside the belly of a B-17 with his hands wrapped around a Browning M2 that shook like a jackhammer. A Japanese Zero appeared at his 10 o'clock, roughly 300 yards away, slicing across his field of view like a thrown dart. Eddie did exactly what every instinct told him to do. He placed his crosshairs directly on the enemy fighter's fuselage and pulled the trigger. 50 rounds tore out of the gun. The tracers carved bright arcs through the air, and Eddie watched each one fly harmlessly behind the Zero's tail. The Japanese pilot didn't even bother to dodge. He flew on untouched as Eddie's ammunition counter spun closer to zero. This wasn't Eddie's personal mistake. The exact scenario was unfolding again and again in nearly every theater of the war during those early years. American gunners, highly trained, highly motivated, and equipped with some of the best machine guns ever built, were missing their targets. Not occasionally, but constantly. Early in 1943, the Army Air Forces conducted an analysis of gun camera footage from bomber missions over both Europe and the Pacific. The findings were devastating. Trained aerial gunners were achieving hit percentages below 4% against crossing targets. 4%. That meant that out of every 100 bullets fired at an aircraft moving across the gunner's view, 96 did not strike anything at all. The math was unforgiving. A typical attack run might last only 8 to 12 seconds before the enemy fighter broke away or moved out of range. The Browning M2 fired around 800 rounds per minute, about 13 rounds every second. Over a 10-second engagement, a gunner could theoretically send 130 bullets into the sky. At a 4% hit rate, perhaps 5 of those rounds would actually hit the target. 5 hits were almost never enough to bring down a Zero, and certainly not enough to stop a rugged aircraft like the Focke-Wulf 190. Both German and Japanese fighters could withstand dozens of 50-caliber impacts and keep flying. The human cost of these failures was catastrophic. In 1943, the 8th Air Force in Europe was losing an average of 188 bombers every month. Each B-17 carried a crew of 10. That meant roughly 1,880 airmen killed, captured, or missing every 30 days. A significant portion of these losses came from bomber formations unable to defend themselves effectively against fighter attacks. The gunners were doing everything their training told them to do, tracking their targets, keeping the sight picture steady, and controlling their bursts. The issue wasn't their bravery or discipline. The issue was physics, and physics cared nothing about courage. Every gunner naturally aimed straight at the target he could see. Instinctively, it felt correct. Point at the thing you want to hit, pull the trigger, and expect the bullets to land where the sights are pointed. That works on a static rifle range or even when hunting an animal moving at 20 miles per hour. But enemy fighters weren't deer. They were moving across the gunner's field of view at more than 300 miles per hour. Later in the war, aircraft such as the Me-262 jet could reach 540. At those speeds, the time required for a bullet to travel from the muzzle to the target meant the fighter would no longer be in the position where the sights were aimed by the time the bullet arrived. The bullet itself moved extremely fast, about 2,900 feet per second from a Browning M2. That sounds nearly instantaneous. In very close ranges against slow targets, it practically was. But in aerial combat, close range still meant 200 to 400 yards, and the targets were darting through the air at speeds that would have been unimaginable 2 decades earlier. A Zero flying at 300 miles per hour covered about 440 feet per second. At a distance of 300 yards, around 900 feet, a 50 caliber bullet needed roughly 0.31 seconds to reach its target. That doesn't sound like long, but in that third of a second, the Zero had already traveled another 136 feet, about the length of 11 cars. The gunner's eye was fixed on where the aircraft had been, but the bullets arrived at where the aircraft no longer was.
They passed through empty air while the fighter continued completely unharmed. This problem was known as deflection error. Scientists had understood the concept on paper long before World War II, but understanding it academically and solving it in the chaos of combat were two entirely separate challenges. The amount of deflection required wasn't small, it was enormous and deeply counterintuitive. Against a fighter crossing at a perfect right angle at a distance of 300 yards, a gunner had to aim roughly 15 to 20 feet ahead of the aircraft's nose. That meant placing the crosshairs on a patch of sky that appeared totally empty and trusting the enemy fighter would fly into the storm of bullets. Every instinct a human being possessed resisted the idea. Gunnery instructors attempted to teach deflection during training, but the results were poor. At the Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School in Laredo, Texas, students went through intense training starting in 1942. They spent hours in turret simulators, fired at towed targets while riding in moving trucks, and studied endless diagrams of proper lead angles. Almost none of this carried over effectively to real combat. The problem came down to complexity. Deflection wasn't a single simple adjustment. It changed constantly with the target's speed, angle, distance, altitude, whether the target was climbing or diving, whether the gunner's own aircraft was turning. A B-17 ball turret gunner engaging a Bf-110 in a frontal attack needed entirely different lead than when firing at the same aircraft making a beam attack from the side.
A gunner had perhaps 4 seconds to evaluate all of those variables while being shot at, while his aircraft jolted from flak impacts, and while his oxygen mask fogged at 25,000 feet. The psychological burden was just as lethal as the technical one. Gunners who managed to survive their first few missions and attempted to apply deflection shooting often gave up after what looked like failed attempts. They would lead the target, fire a burst, watch their tracers streak past what appeared to be empty air in front of the enemy aircraft, and assume they had overestimated the lead. On the next engagement, they would shorten the lead angle, shifting their point of aim closer to the visible aircraft. They were correcting their technique in exactly the wrong direction, trusting the evidence of their eyes instead of the physics they could not see. Gun camera footage from 1943 missions revealed the same behavior again and again. Initial bursts showing some forward lead, with subsequent bursts stepping backward until the gunner was firing directly at or even slightly behind the fighter's visible position. Losses increased dramatically. During the October 1943 raids against Schweinfurt, 8th Air Force records showed a 20% loss rate. 60 bombers failed to return out of 291 dispatched. The aircraft that made it home were riddled with damage, crewmen dead or wounded, hydraulic systems torn apart, engines trailing smoke. In debriefings, gunners expressed the same exasperation. They had fired, their guns had functioned, yet their bullets had not connected. Something fundamental needed to change, and quickly, because at the rate aircraft were being lost, the Allied bombing campaign would collapse long before it reached Berlin. The answer had actually been sitting forgotten in a filing cabinet since 1924, written by a man almost no combat crew had ever heard of. Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle, not the earlier historical figure who invented the defense gun, but an American artillery officer with a deep understanding of ballistics, had produced a technical study titled The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery while teaching at the Army's Field Artillery School. Puckle was not an ivory tower theorist. He had served in France during the First World War, observed the chaotic early attempts at aerial combat, and recognized that emerging aviation speeds would soon make traditional aiming techniques obsolete. His paper laid out the math with uncompromising clarity. As aircraft speeds passed 150 miles per hour, the lead required would surpass anything a human could reliably judge by instinct.
He demonstrated that a target moving 250 miles per hour at a perpendicular angle required the gunner to aim 4 to 5 aircraft lengths ahead of the visible position. His study was filled with charts and tables calculating the necessary lead across various combinations of speed, distance, and crossing angle. A 200-yard shot at a right-angle crossing against a 300-mile-per-hour aircraft required 47 feet of lead. At 400 yards, the lead doubled to 94 feet. The figures were staggering, and Puckle's conclusion was even more alarming. Without mechanical assistance, aerial gunners would be practically ineffective within a decade. The Army filed his work away and ignored it. Through the 1920s and 1930s, aircraft performance increased dramatically, but gunnery instruction remained anchored to First World War doctrine. Instructors focused on marksmanship basics, sight alignment, breath control, trigger discipline, as if students were preparing for a rifle qualification instead of attempting to hit a rapidly maneuvering target in three-dimensional space at 300 miles per hour. The few advocates for advanced deflection training were dismissed as alarmists. The prevailing belief was that American shooters had always been excellent marksmen, drawing on legends like Daniel Boone, Sergeant York, and the folk tradition of frontier sharpshooting. Surely, with proper practice, those skills would carry over into aerial combat. They didn't. When the United States entered World War II in late 1941, the Army Air Force's gunnery training was catastrophically inadequate for modern air warfare. The standard program lasted 4 weeks. Trainees fired about 1,000 rounds in total. Nearly all of those bullets were directed at stationary targets or at slow, predictably moving towed sleeves that traveled perhaps 150 miles per hour in straight lines. Not one training exercise replicated the sheer chaos of an FW-190 plunging through a bomber formation at 400 miles per hour while performing a barrel roll. Graduates earned their wings, boarded bombers, deployed to England or the Pacific, and immediately discovered that their training had not prepared them in the slightest the moment a zero flashed across their gun sights. By mid-1942, desperate officers began combing through old reference materials, searching for any solution. Captain Robert Williams, assigned to the 8th Air Force Gunnery Analysis Section, found Puckle's 1924 paper buried in the archives at Wright Field. He read it in a single sitting and drafted a memo to his commander with only 2 words underlined 3 times. He knew. Puckle had forecast this exact crisis 18 years before a B-17 had ever flown a combat mission. His calculations still held. His warnings had been accurate, and hundreds of American airmen had died because his work had been ignored. The issue was no longer whether Puckle had been correct. The mathematics were irrefutable. The real question was whether a workable solution existed. Expecting gunners to consciously compute deflection angles while under fire was absurd. No human brain could perform trigonometry at combat speed. But if conscious calculation was impossible, perhaps something else could replace it. The British had already begun uncovering a solution born of the same desperation during the summer of 1940. RAF Squadron 609, flying Spitfires out of Middle Wallop, encountered a gunnery problem nearly identical to what American bomber crews would face later. Their pilots were courageous, their aircraft superb, but they were missing far too often. Flight Lieutenant John Dundas reviewed gun camera footage from July and discovered the squadron's hit rate against crossing BF-190s was roughly 6%, only 6 hits for every 100 rounds fired. A Spitfire carried enough ammunition for around 16 seconds of continuous firing. Pilots were expending their entire supply and watching German fighters escape untouched. Squadron leader Horace Darley, commanding the unit, made a drastic decision. He grounded his entire squadron for 3 days during the height of the Battle of Britain, at a moment when every available fighter was urgently needed, and conducted live fire tests that broke nearly every rule in the RAF training doctrine. Darley had been a competitive clay pigeon shooter before the war and understood something about leading fast-moving targets that military theorists had overlooked. The best shotgun shooters did not consciously calculate lead, they felt it. Their brains processed the target's movement subconsciously. Their hands guided the barrel ahead of the clay disc without deliberate mathematical thought. Darley wondered whether fighter pilots could develop a similar instinct. His experiment was brutally simple. He instructed a Hurricane to tow a target banner across the range, while his Spitfire pilots made repeated firing passes. But instead of the normal procedure, aiming carefully and trying to calculate the correct lead angle, Darley ordered them to do something that sounded completely irrational: stop aiming. He told them to focus on the movement of the target, allow their eyes to follow it naturally, and begin firing while they were still turning to track it. The deflection would occur automatically as a consequence of the aircraft's motion, rather than through deliberate effort.
Pilots were told to fire toward where their instincts suggested the target was going, not where their eyes saw it at that moment. The first runs were complete failures. The banner was missed by as much as 50 feet, with bullets stitching harmless lines through empty sky. But Darley forced them to repeat the drill again and again, 40 passes each over the course of 3 days. There were no lectures on ballistics, no trigonometric formulas, no reference charts for lead angles, just relentless repetition paired with a single instruction: fire while you are still moving, not after you've stabilized your aim. By the end of the 3rd day, something extraordinary began to happen. Hit rates started to rise, not dramatically at first, but consistently, from about 6% to roughly 12%. That seemingly modest increase represented a doubling of effectiveness. Twice as many rounds striking enemy aircraft, twice as many kills, or twice as many German fighters limping home too damaged to fly the next day. Darley documented everything and submitted his findings to Fighter Command on August 18, 1940. His report focused on one critical insight. The pilots who improved the fastest were not the ones with the highest pre-war marksmanship scores. It was the men who managed to override their instinct to aim carefully, and instead relied on peripheral vision and motion perception. The conscious mind, Darley explained, was far too slow for the demands of modern air combat. The real solution was to train the subconscious to handle deflection automatically, much like a baseball outfielder intuitively runs to the spot where a fly ball will land without performing a single conscious calculation. Fighter Command shared Darley's conclusions, but adoption was uneven. Some squadrons embraced the method immediately, others dismissed it as unscientific. The RAF training establishment was especially reluctant. Many instructors had spent decades teaching traditional marksmanship, and Darley's approach appeared to contradict everything they believed about proper shooting technique. But combat results were impossible to ignore. Units that adopted the motion-based deflection method displayed noticeably better kill ratios through the autumn of 1940. The evidence was clear enough that by early 1941, the technique was becoming standard practice, even if the official manuals did not yet reflect it. American observers stationed in Britain carefully recorded Darley's methods, but the U.S. Army Air Forces soon realized they faced an entirely different challenge. Fighter pilots had the advantage of using their own aircraft's own movement to generate natural lead and could develop instinctive deflection through repetition. Bomber gunners, however, could not. A Spitfire pilot maneuvered his aircraft to create the correct angle. A B-17 waist gunner, standing in a fixed position while the bomber plowed straight through flak, had no such ability. He could not bank or turn to generate lead. He had only his hands on the weapon and his eyes on the target. If conscious math was too slow and instinctive motion was impossible, then the only viable solution had to be mechanical. That responsibility fell to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, specifically the Radiation Laboratories Division 7, created in early 1942. The name Radiation Laboratory was intentionally misleading, designed to suggest atomic research,
and conceal the fact that the unit was actually developing fire control technologies. The division was led by Dr. Charles Stark Draper, a 40-year-old engineer who had spent much of the prior decade working on advanced gyroscopic navigation instruments. Draper realized the deflection problem was not, at its core, a shooting problem. It was a prediction problem. A gun sight had to show the gunner not where the target currently appeared, but where it would be at the moment the bullets reached it. By July 1943, Draper's team had produced a prototype, the Mark 14 computing gun sight. It looked like something from another world, a reflector sight connected to a gyroscopic assembly that weighed nearly 28 pounds and required electrical power from the aircraft's generator. The gunner controlled it using a mechanical ranging dial. By adjusting the dial until the sight's reference marks matched the enemy aircraft's wingspan, he supplied the system with range data. Then he tracked the target for about 2 seconds, keeping it centered within a small circle. During those 2 seconds, the gyroscope measured the angular velocity, how quickly the enemy aircraft was moving across the field of view. What happened next was astonishing. Inside the sight, a network of cams, gears, and precision-machined components, an analog computer built entirely from metal, processed the data. It combined the gunner's range input, the gyroscope's angular velocity reading, and the known ballistic characteristics of the .50 caliber round, and then computed the exact point in space where the guns needed to be aimed. The result appeared to the gunner as a glowing reticle projected ahead of the target. He no longer fired at the aircraft itself. He fired at the illuminated dot. And if he had ranged correctly and tracked smoothly, that dot represented the exact place where the bullets and the target would meet. The Mark 14 performed calculations that would take a human minutes to work through by hand, yet it solved them 30 times per second, continuously updating as the target's speed and angle changed. Testing at Naval Air Station Norfolk in August 1943 yielded results so dramatic that they seemed almost unbelievable.
Gunners who previously struggled to reach even a 5% hit rate on crossing targets were suddenly achieving 18% the very first day they used the Mark 14. After a week of practice, their accuracy surpassed 25%. That represented a 5-fold improvement over manual aiming, meaning 5 times as many enemy aircraft damaged or destroyed in each engagement. But producing and installing tens of thousands of these computing sites across the entire bomber fleet required time the Allies didn't have. Large-scale manufacturing didn't begin until early 1944, and the first units were allocated to new aircraft leaving the assembly lines rather than retrofitting older bombers already in service. As a result, most gunners flying missions in late 1943 and early 1944 were still using simple iron sights or basic reflector sights with no computational ability. They needed a solution they could apply immediately, something requiring no new hardware, no electrical upgrades, and no wait for production delays. They needed a method that worked with the equipment already mounted on their aircraft. The breakthrough didn't come from engineers or scientists, but from frontline gunners themselves, especially those in the Pacific, where engagements often occurred at clearer ranges than over cloud-covered Europe. Staff Sergeant William Bill Fleming, a waist gunner assigned to the USS Lexington's Air Group Support Staff, had flown 31 combat missions by March 1944 and survived the destruction of 4 aircraft. Fleming wasn't an officer, had no advanced education, and couldn't have explained gyroscopic precession if his life depended on it, but he had fired more than 40,000 rounds in actual combat and had personally seen his fire bring down 7 enemy aircraft. He also kept a notebook. Inside that notebook were unusual sketches, silhouettes of enemy planes with hand-drawn lines extending ahead of their noses indicating where he had actually aimed when scoring hits. Fleming measured his lead by comparing it to the aircraft's own length, 2 plane lengths ahead, or 3 depending on the angle. On March 14, 1944, he presented this notebook during a routine debrief to Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare.
O'Hare, already a Medal of Honor recipient and one of the Navy's most respected tacticians, understood immediately what he was looking at: real-world deflection data gathered in combat. He ordered Fleming to begin training every gunner in the air group using practical demonstrations rather than classroom lectures. This became known as the spot shooting method. Fleming would position gunners at their stations while another crewman walked across the flight deck holding a model aircraft on a long pole. As the model passed by at different angles, Fleming coached the gunner to extend his aim ahead of the target by specific increments: 1 aircraft length for shallow angles, 2 for moderate, 3 or more for steep crossing shots. The key was giving them a simple visual rule they could recall instantly: count plane lengths ahead of the nose, then fire. The Lexington's gunnery officer, skeptical but urgently seeking any improvement, authorized controlled testing during the carrier's operations near Truk Lagoon in late March 1944. He reviewed ammunition expenditure and confirmed hit data from the previous 8 weeks, then compared it to the numbers after Fleming's training began. The results were unmistakable. Before the program, the air group averaged 4.2 hits per 100 rounds against crossing targets. By the end of April, only 6 weeks after adopting spot shooting, the average had risen to 9.1 hits per 100 rounds. Their accuracy had more than doubled. The method spread quickly throughout the Pacific Fleet. By May 1944, modified versions of Fleming's system were being used aboard the Essex, Enterprise, and Bunker Hill. Each ship added its own refinements, but the fundamental principle was unchanged: give gunners a simple visual measurement based on the target's size so they never had to compute anything consciously. A gunner didn't need to think about compensating for 0.3 seconds of bullet travel time. He only needed to remember 3 plane lengths forward for a strong crossing shot. The method worked because it aligned with how human perception naturally functions. The human brain is excellent at comparing relative sizes, but terrible at estimating absolute distances. Telling a gunner to lead by 50 feet meant nothing when he had no intuitive sense of what 50 feet looked like at 300 yards. But telling him to lead by 2 plane lengths gave him a reference he could immediately visualize. The enemy aircraft itself became the measuring tool. All he had to do was extend that measurement into empty space. The Army Air Forces adopted similar techniques by mid-1944, calling it radius of action shooting. Technical manuals began including diagrams showing proper lead expressed in multiples of wingspan or fuselage length. The 8th Air Force Gunnery School at Lavernum, England, rebuilt its entire curriculum around the method in June 1944. Mission losses, still significant, began to decline. In July 1944, bomber losses averaged 3.44% per mission, compared to 5.2% the previous October. Those improved numbers represented hundreds of airmen who completed their missions instead of dying over Germany. But even with the new method, applying it during actual combat was another matter entirely. Psychologists assigned to the Army Air Forces documented this extensively throughout 1944 in interviews with returning gunners. The problem was not a lack of knowledge, it was something deeper and more instinctive. Gunners could repeat the correct lead distances flawlessly during debriefings. The problem was that this conscious knowledge vanished the moment combat stress hit, replaced by a primal instinct that shouted, "Aim directly at the danger." Captain Harold Klain, an Army psychologist stationed at Bobington, documented this pattern by comparing gun camera footage with post-mission interviews. He discovered a consistent phenomenon he called threat fixation collapse. Gunners would begin an engagement using the proper amount of lead, but as the attacking fighter drew closer and the sense of danger increased, their aim point would gradually slide backward until they were firing directly at or even slightly behind the enemy aircraft. Clayton's data showed that this collapse happened most rapidly during head-on attacks, where the combined closing speed of bomber and fighter exceeded 500 miles per hour. The gunner often had only 2 seconds before the enemy opened fire. Under this kind of pressure, deliberate technique evaporated, replaced by a hardwired reaction, point at the frightening object, and fire. The only real solution was repetition on such a massive scale that deflection shooting became entirely automatic, embedded at the same neurological level as walking or catching a ball. This level of training simply wasn't possible in 1942 and 1943, but by late 1944, with the Allies gaining air superiority and training infrastructure finally stabilized, gunnery schools were able to extend their programs. What had been a 4-week course in 1942 expanded first to 8 weeks, then to 10. Students now fired roughly 5,000 rounds during training instead of 1,000. Crucially, more than half of those rounds were now directed at moving targets traveling at realistic combat speeds. The Naval Air Gunner School in Jacksonville, Florida, introduced one of the most effective drills in August 1944. They mounted .50 caliber guns on motorized turrets capable of rapid rotation and elevation changes, while fast boats towed targets across the water at speeds up to 60 miles per hour, constantly varying distance and crossing angle. Trainee gunners engaged these moving targets again and again, 50 to 70 passes each day, until leading the target became instinctive. Instructors did not provide running commentary. They simply had trainees fire, examine their hit patterns, make adjustments, and fire again. The subconscious adapted far more quickly through this feedback loop than the conscious mind could through verbal instruction. Combat analysis of elite gunners, those who survived 30 missions or more, revealed something extraordinary. These veterans maintained stable deflection aim points even under extreme stress. When an FW-190 tore through a formation with cannon flashes bursting from its wings, experienced gunners held the proper lead automatically. Their conscious minds might be terrified. Many later admitted they were certain they were about to die during those moments, yet their hands still moved correctly. They had reached what martial artists call mushin, or no mind, where technique functions without conscious direction. But achieving such mastery required time and ammunition that most wartime trainees never received. The math was unforgiving. If creating a truly expert deflection shooter required 5,000 practice rounds and 10 weeks of intense instruction, but the bomber campaign needed 50,000 new gunners within 6 months, compromises were unavoidable. Most gunners never reached true unconscious competence. They remained stuck in the stage psychologists call conscious competence, capable of performing correct deflection shooting when given time to think, but vulnerable to collapse under sudden stress or unexpected attack patterns. This created an unusual imbalance in combat effectiveness. A bomber formation's defensive strength varied sharply depending on which individual gunners occupied which positions on which aircraft. A formation with several seasoned, deeply trained gunners could repel attacks that would devastate a group of inexperienced crews. German fighter pilots learned this quickly. They began identifying weaker aircraft by watching their initial bursts of fire. Bombers that responded hesitantly or inaccurately became primary targets, while formations that produced immediate, heavy, and well-placed defensive fire were avoided. The revolution in deflection shooting, born from British improvisation and American urgency, did not end with the close of World War II in 1945.
The fundamental idea that you must aim not at where the target currently is, but where it will be, became the basis for every weapon system developed afterward. The Mark 14 computing gun sight was refined into the Mark 18, which served through the Korean War and later evolved into digital fire control computers capable of processing dozens of variables simultaneously. By the time of the Vietnam War, fighter aircraft were equipped with radar-assisted gun systems that calculated lead automatically, requiring pilots only to keep their targets within the system's tracking parameters. The F-4 Phantom's lead computing optical sight performed in microseconds what Draper's mechanical gyroscopes could only solve in fractions of a second. Modern air-to-air combat has moved far beyond gun engagements.
Missiles now handle interception at distances where required lead would be measured in miles instead of feet. The underlying physics, however, remain the same, only the technology has changed. An AIM-120 AMRAAM uses inertial guidance and active radar to constantly recalculate where its target will be, performing deflection calculations thousands of times per second. The F-22 Raptor's AN/APG-77 radar doesn't just follow a target's current position, it predicts the target's future location based on velocity and acceleration. Then positions the aircraft and selects weapons based on that projection. It is the same problem William Fleming solved with pencil sketches in 1944, now executed by computers capable of trillions of operations. Interestingly, the basics of deflection shooting are still taught to modern fighter pilots. Even though guns are now tertiary weapons, the Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, continues to train guns-only maneuvers. Not because pilots expect cannon dogfights, but because learning to visualize where a maneuvering opponent will be builds the spatial awareness required for every form of air combat. A pilot who has mastered deflection shooting intuitively understands closure rate, angle off, and lead pursuit geometry, skills that matter whether firing a cannon or lining up a missile shot. And the lessons extend far beyond aviation. Any system that must engage fast-moving targets uses the same principles. Modern anti-aircraft defenses, from the Phalanx CIWS that protects naval ships to CRAM systems guarding bases, are sophisticated descendants of what those bomber gunners in 1943 were struggling to do by hand. The Phalanx fires 4,500 rounds per minute, 75 rounds per second, at incoming missiles or aircraft, its radar constantly computing and updating the necessary deflection. It performs the same corrections Eddie Kowalski needed over the Solomon Islands, only faster, and without the human hesitation that cost so many lives. Even combat simulator video games teach players the same counterintuitive requirement: aim where the target is going, not where it is. Games like War Thunder and Digital Combat Simulator force players to lead moving targets manually, and newcomers experience the same frustration those 1942 gunners felt watching their shots streak harmlessly behind the enemy until they learn to apply lead. The best players eventually develop the same unconscious competence as wartime veterans, adjusting their aim automatically without conscious calculation. The shift from 4% hit rates in early 1943 to more than 20% by the end of 1944 stands as one of the most dramatic tactical improvements of the entire war. Achieved not through overwhelming production or superior firepower, but by aligning training with human cognition instead of fighting against it. Thousands of aircrew members who might have died made it home. Fighters that once escaped unscathed were shot down. Bombing campaigns that once seemed doomed reached their objectives, all because someone finally recognized that human instinct can be wrong, and that survival sometimes depends on overriding what feels natural and obeying what physics requires. The gunners who learned to fire into empty sky, who trained themselves to shoot at nothing visible and trust that their bullets would meet the target, proved something profound about human adaptability. We are not bound by instinct. With enough understanding, sufficient training, and the urgency of necessity, people can reprogram their reactions to match reality rather than expecting reality to conform to their instincts. That lesson, paid for in blood over Europe and the Pacific, still applies wherever human intuition runs counter to what the situation truly demands.